Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today. As everyone is aware, public health restrictions have been imposed provincially and in some cases municipally, and these have continued to evolve throughout the course of the pandemic. As the pandemic has evolved, I don't need to tell anybody how disruptive the virus has been to the personal and professional lives of not just Calgarians, but everyone. In Calgary, health inspectors, peace officers, and police officers are called upon to conduct enforcement on the provincial orders and the municipal bylaws. This is, of course, a highly polarizing issue. Some members of the community believe public health restrictions should be aggressively enforced in all cases. Others would prefer to see no enforcement whatsoever, and still others agree with some of the restrictions, but not others. As your police service, we've been asked by the Chief Medical Officer of Health to step up the enforcement of the orders to promote compliance as a result of the significant strain on our public health care system, and in particular during this second wave. Our officers see firsthand the stress that is presently on our partners in healthcare. They also see firsthand the tremendous strain that exists in the community. People are concerned for employment, children are home with little to do, and we all have loved ones that we wish we could see. It is against this backdrop that our officers wrestle with the very difficult task of trying to strike a balance between competing challenges and competing perspectives. I can tell you that no police officer wants to be the person stopping others from enjoying normal activities. We hate telling people that they can't gather with loved ones or they can't play hockey on the outdoor rink, as much as they hate hearing us say it. But still, here we are. Last week, police received nearly 500 calls from members of the public relating to public health restrictions. This does not include proactive visits to businesses with public health. Here are a few examples of the types of calls we received. COVID-19 violation, caller saw 4 teenagers going into a house. Caller says upstairs tenant is having a party. Caller reports people are visiting each other at this address. There were 30 plus people on an outdoor rink. Complainant says neighbors are having people over right now that don't belong in the residence. Report of an outdoor fitness class taking place. Reports of neighbors not socially distancing. Reports of 20 plus cars parked at the church. Reports of teens in a car violating COVID rules. You get the idea. Police and bylaw can help flatten the curve by carrying out enforcement where that's appropriate, but success will not come as a result of tickets and enforcement. We will be successful if we, and I mean all of us, come together as a community and follow the public health restrictions to reduce the spread of COVID-19 at this critical time. I'd also caution those who would seek to improperly use public health orders and restrictions by calling in on the neighbor you don't like or your ex or whomever. That is not helpful. While it's not my intention to dissuade people from calling the city when you have a legitimate concern, but I think it's going to be important to consider the seriousness, the relative seriousness of the violation you plan to report before you call, because the reality of it is that's what we're going to have to do. In attending public spaces, private homes, and businesses, we do continue to strive for voluntary compliance where that makes sense. The majority of Calgarians are understanding and cooperative. This is why we've issued fewer than 100 tickets in total since the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we've increasingly been running into those who not only refuse to do their part, but some have refused to comply with our requests and some have subjected our officers to abuse and personal attacks. I want to be crystal clear. We do not live in a society where a person can pick and choose the laws they follow. Laws become unenforceable if people are free to simply walk away from officers without identifying themselves. There is a time and a place to debate laws and to argue your innocence. That is in the courts. It is not at the roadside, it is not in the park, and it is not on the ice. As we've recently seen, this sort of behavior can result in more serious consequences that are completely avoidable by simply cooperating with officers' requests for basic compliance, or better still, voluntarily complying with the public health restrictions so no officer ever needs to ask. Just to conclude, this past week, we did see some incidents of unavoidable conflict between officers and some citizens. We need to maintain our focus on the big picture. These restrictions are temporary. We're all members of the community, and we're all doing our very best to manage through these extraordinary circumstances. Working together, we will get through the holidays, and we will get through COVID-19. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Plakaitis of the City of Calgary bylaw for his comments. Chief Plakaitis.
Thank you, Chief. Good afternoon, everyone. Our officers continue to respond to public health order violations as we remain in a state of local emergency. The health and safety of Calgarians continues to be a priority for our officers. We understand that these are different and for many difficult times, especially during the holiday season, but we must work together to get through this pandemic. I recognize that there's a lot of fatigue and frustration and a strong desire to get back to a sense of normal. This goes for our officers as well. We know that physical activity contributes greatly to the overall health and well-being of individuals, but we must do these things within the scope of the provincial health orders. The City of Calgary has been working with the province to clarify guidelines around outdoor skating and the use of outdoor rinks. The province has set capacity limits depending on the size of the rinks. In a typical 200-foot outdoor rink, there is a maximum of 50 people allowed on the ice at once. Again, these limits vary depending on the size of the rink, and physical distancing of 2 meters must be followed with those outside of your household at all times. While this is the information our officers have to help us enforce the Public Health Act, we are encouraging the province to provide additional clarity to better help the public understand the regulations and to allow us to do our jobs more effectively. We understand that some people are frustrated with the new health orders, and we encourage them to find lawful ways to express their concerns with elected officials. Breaking the rules does not address the issue. It creates difficult situations in an already difficult time and will extend the time that we are under this public health order. We would ask for understanding from Calgarians that what we are doing is for the overall health and safety of citizens. When you host a house party, join a protest without wearing a mask, or attend a church service that is over capacity, you are putting yourselves and other people at risk. And the same goes for getting together in large groups to play a game of hockey. There is just no way that you can maintain the 2 meters of separation space and do that activity safely. I'll just close by, again, thanking the overwhelming majority of citizens in this city for the sacrifices that they've made through this difficult time and for doing their part to protect the health and safety of others around them. I will now turn it over to Dr. Jameson, who is the medical director of the Foothills Hospital, for a few comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks for your time today, and for those of you watching the live stream. My comments will be brief. We've clearly entered a significant surge in COVID activity in Calgary and in Alberta, and responding to this requires a whole community approach. And so I'm grateful for our partnership with community services, including Calgary Police Services. As community transmission increases, the pressures on our healthcare system grow. And I would assure you that we are working around the clock to make sure that health services are available for the people of Calgary, but it is extremely important that we all follow the directives of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And this is for the protection of our community, our patients, our families, and our healthcare workers who serve you every day. By working together to reduce the spread of COVID, we can reduce the need for hospitalizations, for ICU beds, for demands on our hospital and our emergency departments. And really that's so that we can continue to provide care, not just for our patients with COVID, but for the other patients in our system who depend on our help every day. So we appreciate your help and your cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jameson. We will now open the floor to questions, beginning with CBC Calgary. Okay, we'll move on to City News Calgary, please. David, are you with City News? I'm afraid we can't hear you. We'll try and unmute you.
Sorry, I'm not with City News.
Okay, thank you. We will move on to CTV Calgary.
Hi there, if I could jump in, I'm Kevin from CTV Calgary. Question here for Chief Neufeld. Chief, we saw lots of incidents over the weekend and at the start of, or the end of last week regarding protesters being ticketed, as well as hockey players being ticketed and I guess in one case arrested. What sort of pushback have police received from people that they're trying to enforce these health rules on? And does that give the officers pause when they try to communicate with hockey players, for example, that they can't be doing what they're doing?
Good question, Kevin. Yeah, so we have seen that sort of thing. I think the interactions are, well, they're challenging interactions. And what I've seen, and of course, the sample size that I've seen is not huge. But from what I can see and what I've been hearing from members is a lot of it is just around not agreeing more so with the restrictions. And I mean, when would we ever get in a situation, you think in the last, it's very ironic even to think about the idea that we would be going to the rinks and having to tell people that they're not able to play hockey. Ordinarily, the police go there and they would, pick up the shinny game with the folks that are there. But like I say, here we are. And I think there's a lot of people that don't, there's some don't agree, some don't understand. But for the most part, I would say too, the interactions tend to be fairly positive and we tend to see compliance. So like I say, I think there is lots of times some disagreement early on, and there's sometimes some misunderstanding, but generally that can be cleared up, and generally we receive compliance. I think that's probably a fair statement.
We've heard in the past that police, when they're attending these events where there can be some high tension, that you're more so gathering information, and then later on in the week, you may lay tickets or seek further penalties against people breaking the rules. Is that something we may see further to what we've already seen for the weekend protests, the anti-mask protests, and some of these hockey games?
Well, so the approach that you're speaking actually applies directly to the anti-mask protests that we've seen. A lot of times, because the gatherings involve a lot of people, and it can be a fairly dynamic situation, we tend not to go into the middle of that. And I think the challenges of doing that were underscored on Saturday. We saw toward the end of the event, officers were dealing with a couple of individuals who they were going to ticket, and we saw a large group of people go over and crowd into that space and begin to interfere with the officers as they did that. So that's why we don't do that. So typically that approach that you've described, Kevin, would be one we would use for mass gatherings. Typically, if we're going to the parks or the skate parks or the hockey rinks or whatever, usually we'll deal with that right at the time. And in most cases, I can't think of other than the one that you talk about from late last week, I can't think of a ticket being issued in a situation like that.
Thank you, Kevin. Do you have any follow-up?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
We will move on to Global Calgary, please.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Hi, it's a question for the chief. There was a concern raised by a city councillor that there's been an appearance of more groups such as Soldiers of Odin and Proud Boys. Is that a concern that those types of people are showing up at these rallies?
Yeah, I would say that the big thing is behavior. I think there's all kinds of people at the rallies. I attended yesterday's rally myself, and there's large groups of people. some representing different groups. I think the thing we're really keying on is the behavior while in attendance. And for the most part, I think this is the 10th rally that we've had since around August in relation to the marches for freedom. And all of them have been actually really quite positive, and we haven't had a lot of issues. So there is lots of different people, you're absolutely right, attending the rallies, but for the most part, they've actually been quite positive.
Carolyn, do you have a follow-up question at this time?
Do you have a number of the tickets that were handed out Saturday and Sunday?
I think the number was around 30. We'll confirm this for you, Carolyn, but I think the number of tickets was around 30 in total. And then I believe on as a result of Saturday's events there were 5 criminal charges that came out of that.
And when you say the 5 criminal charges, is that the hockey incident or the rallies, the Saturday rally?
No, that was from the rally. Toward the end of the rally, I was just mentioning there that officers were dealing with a couple of individuals with the intention of issuing a ticket, and they were not that far south of Olympic Plaza. And there was a number of people who sort of saw that happening and went down and were intervening in the events there. So there was some charges that came out of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Carolyn. We'll move on to the Globe and Mail.
Hi, it's James Keller here. Can you explain, there seemed to have been more enforcement at the Saturday rally than in previous events. So what changed? Was it something about the rally, or is this a change of strategy? Or like what prompted the police to take a bit more of an aggressive approach this week as opposed to previous weeks?
Yeah, good question. So previous weeks, as you would know, we were focusing on the organizers of the rallies. And the hope was actually that by sort of targeted enforcement with those that were organizing the rallies, that might actually have a deterrent effect on the number of people who were attending. And so that did not seem to be the case. We were still seeing similar numbers the following week. So there was an expansion of the enforcement to include others who either maybe were repeat people who were attending the rallies, or perhaps individuals who were, a little bit difficult to deal with during the rallies. It was targeting individuals who had been identified for enforcement. So just to broaden it out and increase the deterrent effect.
I've got a quick follow-up. So what is the department's position on these rallies in general? I mean, is it your understanding that under the public health orders, that any gathering, even for a sort of a political demonstration, would be prohibited, or where does this fall in the public health orders? Just the fact of having a rally, let alone other things that might be going on.
Yeah, it would be an outdoor gathering, of course, and that would be prohibited and be restricted by numbers. And then, of course, there's mask wearing and distancing. So there's a number of different issues with respect to those mass gatherings. But certainly, it's an interesting time for us because we've seen similar gatherings in downtown Calgary for many months and in fact years. And so ordinarily police would be engaged positively with folks to help them to express some of these rights. And this is just one of these times where because of the health restrictions and where we are with the pandemic, the restrictions actually prohibit some of those things. So again, we're trying to reinforce the message to the people who are legitimately wanting to express their rights that this is temporary, and that I actually think the Chief Medical Officer of Health may have even released some information in relation to how you could actually go about this, because we've seen other groups sort of change the way that they were demonstrating so that they could comply with the public health restrictions. So it can be done, but there are certain groups that are not heeding that advice.
Thank you, James. We'll move on to Livewire.
Hey, Chief Neufeld. Just a quick question here. You talked about not calling in on the neighbors that you don't like, etc. Is there, do you have a sense of how often you're getting those types of calls, and how are you dealing with them? If they're like false alarms, if you will.
Well, I think it's rare, to be honest, James. I don't think it's been a huge problem just yet. I guess as I look forward, though, into the coming week here with the holidays and certainly people being at home, I do worry about an increase in those numbers. But I think what we're finding is those tend to be some of the more volatile interactions, because there's emotion and there's sort of subtext beneath why we end up at somebody's house. And then you find out that there's longstanding conflict perhaps between a neighbor, or there's might be a bit more to it. And, the officers go there and they end up hearing all of this, and you just feel like, gosh, like I wish we weren't here. And so again, just imploring people to just consider that when you're calling in like I say, the relative seriousness. I don't want to suggest that violations of the orders are not serious, but again, when you think of comparing some of the things we've seen to some of the other ones, they certainly do exist on a continuum for sure.
Omar, do you have any follow-up questions?
I don't. Thank you.
Thanks, Omar.
Thank you. Moving on to post media. I'm going to take that as a pass, but if you do have a question, just let us know at the end.
Hi,
We'll move on. Oh,
I think Bill was muted there, and I just saw that he unmuted. So go ahead.
Yes, Chief Neufeld, I'm wondering if you could tell us what the specific types of charges that were laid on Saturday. Were they all assault charges?
Yeah, there was some obstructing a peace officer. There was some assault police officer, and there were also some resisting arrest. I think you're on mute, Bill.
Sorry,
I can't hear
Bill.
Yeah, I was also wondering how your officers are responding to these complaints about possible illegal gatherings. Have you been laying charges or issuing tickets for these residential incidents?
I think we've been going to those, Bill, when we do get them, and I've read off some of the types of calls that we're attending, and so we do go to the call. We see who's there. One of the challenges I think with these types of reports is that we're balancing the response to public health infractions along with our calls to response to other types of calls that the police would conventionally attend. And so it's one of these situations where we have to, the nature of the offense is such that we have to find people committing the offense. And so if we get there too far after the fact and people have left or whatever, or some of the people have left, there's really little we can do at that point. It does present a real challenge. So responding to these sorts of things in a timely way is important as well once the calls are received.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, we will move on to Radio Canada.
Oh, maybe it's me. Do you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. My name is Charlotte Dumoulin. I'm working with Radio-Canada. Maybe if you can tell me what could be a solution or what would you like to see to solve this kind of situation? Yeah,
I think, Charlotte, thank you for the question. I think what I would suggest is just reminding people of the importance of these orders and reminding that it's not about individuals right now. We need to sort of, I think, set aside our own desires because we all have them. It's the same for our officers. But I think that right now we're at a very critical place in terms of the pandemic and the challenges that our healthcare system are facing. And so as a result of that, I think voluntary compliance with these orders for the remainder of the time that they're in effect, I think that's really, really critical. And I think if we have that as a community, recognizing that there's a bigger sort of prize or a bigger objective at play here, I think we'll move through this together with the least amount of strife.
Perfect. Just for a follow-up, I think you said it, but I'm not sure. Do you see an increase of those calls and those tickets issued recently?
Yeah, I would say we have seen an increase in the tickets issued, but let me tell you, the increase really has been around the mass gatherings and the protests. So that's where we've sort of targeted some more enforcement, and that's where we'd see the increases. The number of tickets that we're writing as a result of calls that we're going to people's homes or to parks or rinks or whatever has been conventionally very low, and it remains very low.
Thank you, Charlotte. We'll move on to 660 News.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Jeff, we can hear you.
All right, perfect. I just want to know if you're finding that people are just disregarding the rules, or are you finding that more people are just confused about what they need to do?
I think it's both, Jeff. So in some cases, we're finding that people are just simply disregarding, and mainly because they don't agree, or in some cases, they just feel that the orders are unlawful. And so in those cases, the only thing that we can really do, education is not going to be effective. So the thing that we can do is actually issue the ticket and then let them go to court and contest their feelings about that. But I think there are cases, and I think Chief Placatus hit on it. I think there are cases with respect to things like gatherings and rinks and what can you do there, where I do think a lot of times people are confused. And so people in the community will call, our officers will go down, they'll interact with people and let them know what's required. There does tend to be in the city of Calgary, I think in most outdoor rinks and parks, there does tend to be signage, I believe, that indicates what people need to do. But let's face it, it can be fuzzy. And so at times our officers go down and speak to people, and we tend to be able to get voluntary compliance, which is good.
Do you have a follow-up to that, Jeff?
No, I'm okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
That's great. Have we missed anybody? And does anyone have any questions for Chief Placatus?
Can I jump in with a follow-up?
Please go ahead, Kevin. David, we're still having some feedback issues, so perhaps there's an audio issue at your end. Go ahead, Kevin.
Sure. Chief Neufeld, at the start of your speech, you touched on you're receiving a lot of calls over the last week to people's homes, neighbors reporting on neighbors in a lot of cases. You also emphasized that people need to make sure that when they're calling the police, it's for an appropriate reason. Can you be a little bit more specific, maybe even providing an example of when, let's say I want to call police on a neighbor that I think is doing something wrong, what is appropriate, or what is a useful use of the police's time versus something that is less important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what some of the things that we might look at in terms of prioritizing our own responses to those types of calls would be the size of the gathering. And also if it's at a home or whatever there, and it looks to be a large gathering where perhaps the neighbors know that that many individuals don't live there, that might be an appropriate one where you'd give us a call. I think if we start talking about the ones where, you've got somebody parked in a car outside of a residence, there's a good chance that by the time the police get there, the car may be gone. And so you've got a couple people in a car. So you can see where, when you're talking about, I guess, the impact of the calls, the issue that you're going to report, some of them have a larger impact, I guess, than others, to be fair to say.
And do you have a follow-up to that?
No, I'm okay. Thank you.
Can I get another question in, please?
Absolutely, Carolyn, go ahead.
Yeah,
And just before you go, David, if you want to put your question in the chat, I will say your question for you, since we seem to be having some audio troubles. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Well, it's going back to Ryan's comment, and I think he said asking for clarity from the province on the rules. Would that, Chief, fall into your mention when you said that it tends to be fuzzy? Are you looking for clarity from the province too?
Sorry, Ryan's here as well, but I would say, I think the question is for me. And so, well, we want as much clarity as we can around all of these issues or the orders, and the ones that certainly are causing challenges. So I think Ryan's reference to the ice rinks are certainly one. Our people that are managing the COVID response at the Calgary Police Service are tied into the team with Ryan and the Emergency Operations Center here in Calgary. So that works is really being done simultaneously on behalf of us all to make sure we all have the clarity we need.
So it's fair to say, do you have the clarity or not right now?
Well, I would say right now it's what's clear to me is that we still end up going to a number of the parks and the gatherings at the skate parks and that sort of thing where people don't understand or they have questions. And so I can tell you that I'm not sure if the breakdown is in the signage or in the communication or whether it's in the order itself. And I would defer to Ryan on the writing of the order itself because I'm not as familiar with it as he may be. But But I would say that there obviously needs to be some additional clarity or attempts for folks, because there are times where, like I say, we go to respond to these types of calls, and it's clear that the issue is people just have an issue with the restriction, period. So it's not a question of misunderstanding. It's just a question of not agreeing. In other cases, and we have seen that a number of times, folks don't seem to understand, and our officers are spending time explaining the orders to them. So if that's the case, then there's probably some additional work to be done that would help people to understand and get clarity.
Thank you.
Hello. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, hi. Yeah, as far as these the skating rink issue goes, you mentioned a 200-foot rink. There's a 50-person allowance for that. Has that changed since this Thursday incident?
I don't believe so, but I'm going to let Ryan speak to that because he's very versed on this.
Thank you for the question. I'm actually not sure when that those additional guidelines came out. I think this is relatively recent, and I'm not sure if it was in response to any specific event. But the information that we've received from the province, again, on a typical 200-foot outdoor rink, is that there's a maximum of 50 people allowed on the ice at one time. Now, that'll vary based on the size of the rink. But I think, there's probably an opportunity to make, certain activities more explicit within the order. No hockey, no shinny, as opposed to, us trying to determine whether there was physical distancing violations, or if there was more than 10 people engaged in a fitness class, or members of other households all using that shared space. So I think just in terms of providing a little bit more clarity and being a little bit more explicit, I think would help in having the public understand what the regulations are, and it would also help our officers in trying to diffuse some of those situations.
Thanks. I just have a follow-up, if it's okay, with for Chief Neufeld. And it's this. You talked about people, reporting possible COVID-19 infractions on their neighbors. There are a lot of people out there who really have a problem with that. They consider it snitching. I've heard this whole term. It's like the Stasi from the old East Germany, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and it possibly sows distrust among neighbors. How do you react to those kinds of feelings?
Well, I suppose it's natural. I can relate to you. I talked with an officer the other day that was saying that they responded to a call very similar to that one, where a neighbor had called in relation to seeing another car or whatever that was strange at the neighbor's house. And so the officer was telling me that when he responded to the call, he found out that the individual who lived in the home had a very challenging pregnancy and needed some assistance. And so there can be reasons why people would have somebody over to their house that would be completely legitimate. And so I guess that's my point about trying to trust your neighbor the best you can. There are times where you may see a huge number of cars, or it's obvious to you that something seems amiss. But I think the threshold shouldn't be set so low that every time the Amazon delivery guy pulls up, you're calling the police.
It's James Keller here from the Globe. Could I get a quick follow-up to my questions earlier? I'm just wondering, we've seen in other cities like Montreal in particular over the weekend, there was quite significant enforcement. Almost 300 tickets were handed out, $400,000 in fines. We're nowhere near that, even what happened on the weekend. So do you anticipate tactics here to sort of expand to something that widespread, or what's next in terms of widening out and broadening out the level of enforcement we've got here?
That's a good question, and I absolutely hope not. I guess the point that I'm trying to drive home here today is, to the extent that we can get voluntary compliance in relation to what is a temporary set of restrictions designed to deal with the state of COVID-19 at this moment and through the holidays, I think we'll be in a good place. There's people that say to us, "Oh, you're writing tickets because you're trying to raise revenue or whatever." That is not the case. We would be happy if we didn't have to write a single ticket and didn't have to charge a single person in relation to to the COVID-19 issues or criminal issues around that. For the most part, voluntary compliance is right where we'd like to be. And with the majority of Calgarians, we realize we have it. And we're just sort of appealing to those who are either sitting on the fence or who have a foot on both sides of it right now.
Thanks very much. Does anybody have any last questions for Chief or for Dr. Jameson before we let him go, as I'm sure he has a very busy day ahead of him? Okay, we're good. Chief, there was one question here from David, who's been having a bit of trouble with his audio that I'll relay to you here. He's been contacted by a family who had another couple over for dinner last night. He says that the officers arrived and that they were fined what he says is a total of $40,000. So he wants to know, how does the crime compare to the fine?
I would have to say I couldn't speak to that, David. That sounds awfully high to me. I would think that if you were going to receive a ticket, the ticket's $1,000 plus an additional $200 for a victim surcharge. That's $1,200. So by my math, if somebody had two people over and there was two of you, you would have a hard time getting to $40,000. So I would really need more information about that one.
Thank you, Chief. David, I have sent you the email address for our public affairs email address. Please send us the details of that incident and we will look into it for you. If there are no other questions for Chief Plakaitis or Chief Neufeld or the doctor, we will let everybody go, and thank you for joining us today.